Jaynes would say, and I would agree, that animals do not have consciousness at all. They do, however, have extremely complex, sophisticated cognitive systems. And I always find it strange when people say, oh, scientists discovered that crows can do this, that, or that they can use tools, or that do animals have minds? It's a silly question. Of course they have minds. But in order to have human consciousness, the way Jaynes talks about it, that's a very linguistic, cultural type of phenomenon. You have to have a well-developed neocortex in order to symbolize, to develop metaphors. And so right now, of course, only humans have that. So there's a very sharp line, I think, between human consciousness and animal cognition. But, I want to stress that that does not mean there are no continuities between animal behavior and humans. In fact, Jaynes himself was an animal psychologist. He started out trying to find out what consciousness was by studying animals. And he eventually realized that there are no answers there. And that if he wanted to study something human, he had to study something human, which was human history. And so he decided to go back in time to see what other great thinkers and philosophers said about consciousness. And he found something very strange, because when he came to about 1000 BCE, people were not talking about consciousness, or even their feelings are sort of muted. There's a sort of a flat effect when it comes to what we would call psychology in the historical record. And so that was one of the roots that led Jaynes down to what I would call a discovery of the nature of consciousness. So that's interesting. Intellectual irony is that Jaynes started with animals, but realized they can only explain so much about.
Sorry,
yeah.
I just wanted to remind our listeners that this idea of Jaynes's consciousness is essentially the ability to self-reflect, and this idea of an interior space, the ability to other yourself. It's not awareness or anything that we would associate with consciousness in general at this point.
Do you think that culture requires conscious interiority?
So, when you say culture, of course, that can have different meanings. So if you mean for people to have culture, they do not necessarily need consciousness, of course, right? Because the ancient Egyptians, Mesopotamians, they built incredible advanced civilizations without being conscious. So they certainly had strong cognitive skills, and they certainly had culture. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
they did those essentially through mimicry or following each other's patterns. I guess
they did it through, they did it through the same way we would do, through cognition. So this is kind of a problem with the language, because when we talk about consciousness, we automatically assume if you're conscious, to be conscious, you must be very intellectually sophisticated, and that's not necessarily true. So the ancient Egyptians, there were limits on their science, of course, but basically they did develop basic arithmetic and geometry. They wrote literature, but if you read the literature, it doesn't seem very psychologically sophisticated, but they could do a lot of things.
Like their characters don't self-reflect, and they don't see themselves as making decisions, is what we really mean here.
That's right. And, this is a problem. So when you look at ancient text, there are very bad translations. What I've noticed is people will impose modern vocabulary onto an ancient text rather than letting the people themselves speak. And, I could give many examples of that in the case of Egypt that really shocked me, where they were not recording, the translator was not interpreting what they actually said, they're interpreting what I think they should say. And that's not a scientific way to proceed, in my opinion.
Right. I noticed a few people on Earth were arguing against this theory, pointing to the ancient text, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Are
Right.
you aware of
Right.
these complaints that there are
Sure.
perhaps some demonstrations of conscious interiority going back 5,000 BC or something like that?
Right. Right. So the problem with the Epic of Gilgamesh is that there are different versions of it, and it was added onto throughout the centuries. So I'm not an expert in that, but what I would say before we reach any conclusions, we have to be very precise, if we can. Which version are you talking about? What exactly in the text are you talking about? And then, as I just discussed a minute ago, we have to look at, is it a good translation? So I would never say that there are no glimmers of consciousness or something like consciousness in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There probably are. And so that's what I mean when I say we need a subtle analysis, that there's a transition from complete non-consciousness throughout a bicameral period, and then a semi-bicameral, then a semi-conscious period. And if you look at things that way, then you can, it doesn't look, the evidence to me, what I'm trying to say, doesn't seem so convincing. If you look at something like the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Hmm. Quinn, why were you thinking that consciousness would be necessary for cultural development?
It was, well, I was leading to a longer presentation on animals and conscious interiority. And I think that there has been evidence of culture in animals. Elephants, dolphins, whales, crows. There is this sort of the exchange of cultural memes between individuals. There's this memory, there's a tendency, there's a way of doing things, there's dialects. And so if we could agree that culture and conscious interiority were linked, then I was going to push towards the idea that perhaps animals have conscious interiority, but humans don't know how to read their books. They don't know how to interpret their language, How do you read a whale's book?
But it also seems like conscious interiority appeared after books, even with humans and so forth.
Well, yeah, that's why I didn't make the presentation.
I see.
But I do think you make a very important point about the culture of animals, because years ago, we were taught that that's the dividing line between humans and animals. Animals don't have tools, culture, people do. But that's not true. There's so many examples, as you know. I was just the other day on National Geographic. There's something about orangutans using some sort of leaf as a balm for their sore muscles. They were actually using it for medicinal purposes. And of course, we all see crows are oft-cited example of using sticks and stones to do different things. So, and this is apparently passed down.
Mm-hmm.
This knowledge, this is not genetic information. This is extra genetic information that animals do pass down. So, this sounds a bit mystical, but I certainly would entertain the idea that eventually animals could evolve develop something like a human culture. It may take another 10, 20, 50,000 years. I don't know, like dogs, our best friends. And who knows? They could be a type of animal consciousness.
Well, it seems like the emergence of unicamerality had a catastrophic event that preceded it and a strong social need. Mm-hmm. Where there was basically this Bronze Age collapse. What exactly happened during the Bronze Age collapse?
Well, that's sort of the challenge, because a lot of things happened. There were a number of what we would call regional powers: the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Mitanni, and basically their civilizations overnight pretty much collapsed. And as I said before, historians give a lot of different answers. They say, oh, it had to do with introduction of new technology, better swords or chariots, or it was because of environmental stressors, or it was because invaders from mysterious invaders. No one knows where they're from. It had to do with probably corruption in the political state structures of these empires. So there are, I think, a lot of things probably happened at the same time. It was a perfect storm. However, what's missing in analysis of this collapse is what role did the individual psyche play? And I think the individual psyche was just not up to all these changes. And this really pushed forward the cultural development of a language that could be used to better cultivate and describe what we were feeling. It allowed people to narrate time better. So again, excuse me, that may not sound like a very clear answer, but I think there are a lot of things going on